Donald Trump's lawyers this afternoon rejected special counsel Robert Mueller's latest offer for an interview. Jay Sekulow, one of the president's lawyers, confirmed that a letter had been sent, and Rudy Giuliani added what sounded like a threat, saying in a statement, quote, millions of pages of documents along with testimony from dozens of witnesses have been provided. We're restating what we have been saying for months. It is time for the Office of the Special Counsel to conclude its inquiry without further delay. A source close to Giuliani and Mr. Trump tells me today of the president's legal team's strategy, quote, both sides are being played, the special counsel's office and the president. There won't ever be a presidential interview. The New York Times reports on the 8-month-long back and forth over the elusive presidential interview, writing, quote, the negotiations have dragged on in part because the president's lawyers are concerned that if he is interviewed, Mr. Trump could perjure himself. They had been prepared last week to tell Mr. Mueller that Mr. Trump would decline an interview. But the president, who believes he can convince Mr. Mueller that he is innocent, pushed his lawyers to continue negotiating. It's the rare instance in which Robert Mueller and Donald Trump want the very same thing, which is striking, especially in light of new reporting we brought you earlier this week from a source close to the Trump legal effort who tells us that there are serious concerns that the president may have already engaged in conduct that leaves him vulnerable to charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Joining us to discuss the day's developments, some of our favorite reporters and friends. Daniel Goldman is a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, now an MSNBC contributor. Heilman is back. He's an NBC and MSNBC national affairs analyst.
Like Madonna.
You are. I gave you one name.
Pele.
Someday you'll thank me. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Daily Beast politics editor Sam Stein is here, and my friend Steve Schmidt's also here. We're going to boil you down to one name too. Take us through the significance of this sort of. I think it's just a sideshow. I mean, people have told me that from Emmett Flood to Don McGahn to Rudy Giuliani to everyone who is now departed the president's team, no one thinks the president can survive an interview with the special counsel.
The president can't survive Twitter. How is he going to?
That's right. The special counsel is now looking at his tweets.
I mean, every tweet has, a misstatement or a lie. So they're absolutely right to be concerned that if the president were to go into an interview with incredibly well-prepared prosecutors who have not just the president's tweets and his own statements, but, as Rudy Giuliani correctly pointed out, millions of documents, testimony from dozens of witnesses. They know the backstory much better than any of us sitting here know it. And when they questioned Donald Trump, he would lie within the first 30 seconds. Because it's just he believes that what he says is true. And the problem is when you're dealing with a federal investigation, there are objective facts. It's not a subjective belief. And so I think what's really going on here is that this is an effort by his lawyers, and I don't know how much he's implicated in this or not, to set up a situation where they can say to the American public, we wanted to, it's not our fault, but it's Bob Mueller's fault. He's being unreasonable because it's quite absurd.
Let's put that up, because here's what they've ruled out. They've ruled out questions about obstruction of justice, questions about collusion, and questions that could lead Trump to lie, I guess, about obstruction or collusion. I mean, that's really all that they're investigating.
So what is the interview?
I mean, this is the special counsel's investigating Russian meddling and whether or not anyone in the Trump campaign colluded or conspired with the Russians, and whether or not in the process of attacking the investigation and trying to fire Jeff Sessions as sitting attorney general, trying to fire Rod Rosenstein, trying to impede the investigation, whether the president has obstructed justice. So other than their golf games, what else would he talk about?
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why it's a sideshow. But let's step back for a second. This is an active, ongoing, legitimate investigation, no matter what the president says. The president of the United States is a subject of that investigation, or at a minimum, it's related to his campaign. What world are we living in where the president of the United States will not sit down for a legitimate interview as part of an investigation? That's shocking. Every government official that's involved in an investigation sits down and tells it, or they resign.
Our old boss, George W. Bush, and the Vice President Dick Cheney sat for an interview with Pat Fitzgerald, who was investigating a special counsel investigation into the leaking of Valerie Plame's name. And you're right. I mean, I guess Bill Clinton had to be subpoenaed before he testified. But the idea that they're going to sidestep the special counsel investigation into the president's campaign because they're afraid the president would lie is sort of another Trumpian reveal.
And it doesn't seem to be particularly legally compelling as grounds to avoid being interviewed by the special counsel in all of this. Look, at the end of the day, every statement that this White House, that this president, senior members of the administration, the campaign have made about what went on in the campaign, about James Comey's firing, it's all been lies. And so that's what the vulnerability here is that the special counsel, as was pointed out, they have a good sense, knowing much more than we do here, what exactly it is that happened or didn't happen. And I think that Trump knows, and those facts are not compelling in his favor, probably.
And John Hamlin, someone involved, a former senior Justice Department official, very well-versed and having been in the room for special counsel interviews with subjects and witnesses, said that what it would look like would be that while Robert Mueller may be in the room, it would probably be one of his deputies involved as well in the questioning. And there could be stacks of binders there with the testimony of perhaps his White House counsel, the testimony perhaps of his sitting attorney general. And the idea that it's a perjury trap, no one traps you into lying. I mean, to avoid the perjury trap, all you'd have to do is tell the truth. But Rudy and Jay seem to be saying that he's incapable of that.
Yeah, well, yes, they've been saying that over and over again. Just to go back to, because I think it's relevant to this question. But first of all, I think the president sometimes believes the things he's saying when he says things that are not true. Other times the president knows full well that things are not true, and he's just lying. He's lying with conscious forethought. I point you to his years-long campaign about how Barack Obama was born in Kenya. The president knew that was a lie, and he lied anyway for political gain. Bill Clinton did not have to be subpoenaed, and it's important that he didn't, because he was threatened with the subpoena in order to avoid the subpoena, because it's not been tested, the question of whether or not a sitting president can be subpoenaed. So it's relevant to this matter now, because it is a sideshow what Rudy is saying. And it's a sideshow what Jay Sekulow is saying. It's a sideshow what Donald Trump is saying about whether they're negotiating, not negotiating, does he really want to testify, does he not want to testify. What's not a sideshow is the special counsel's posture in all of this, is Bob Mueller's posture in this, because as he goes through the motions of watching them do this sideshow, he is putting himself in a position where he can say, we have given them every opportunity. We have been open to negotiations. We've been willing to put some things in writing to limit the scope. I want to be in a position where we've given them every opportunity to be reasonable, and now, when I make the move, if he does make the move to subpoena the President of the United States, this will not have been a sideshow for him, because he's playing a very serious game, and this is where it's going to come to, is the question of, does Bob Mueller decide that it is imperative that he must get Donald Trump in front of a grand jury and get questions answered, and if it is imperative to the point where it's willing to delay, where it's worthwhile to delay the investigation, have it take additional months, and maybe lose in court, because we don't know what the Supreme Court would say on this matter. That's where we're going, and that's why, although there's a lot of this that's comical and stupid, in the end, a very serious thing is happening here, and in a frivolous way.
And what I agree with everything John said, and what Trump is relying on is Jay Sekulow and Rudy Giuliani telling him that Bob Mueller won't take that step. And I have been counseled over and over again from people who are still in contact with Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller doesn't leak about this investigation, but there are people who worked alongside him during his, 13 years as FBI director, Democratic and Republican veterans of the Justice Department and FBI, who say that Bob Mueller wouldn't tell his mother what he was going to do. So the idea that they've given the president the reassurance that he won't do that. I think the New York Times reports today that they've told the president that Bob Mueller wouldn't want to risk losing in court. Trump's lawyers this year, Mr. Mueller threatened to subpoena the president if he didn't sit for a voluntary interview. Law enforcement officials who've worked with Mr. Mueller, a longtime federal prosecutor and head of the FBI from 2001 to 2013, believe he will try to use every tool he has to get the president to answer questions, and that he will probably subpoena him if he does not agree to be questioned voluntarily. Those are the kinds of people who worked alongside him. The president's lawyers have tried to reassure the president that he wouldn't take that step. That seems like a dangerous miscalculation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, how does one follow Pele? How does one sing? How does one sing after Madonna?
One doesn't. One passes back the balance of your time to Steve Schmidt. Is what one does.
I would say there's a. In addition to all this, I feel like there's a cat and mouse game happening here in which the president's legal team are trying to get Mueller to show some cards. So you say, no, I'm not going to sit down for those questions, but send me some written ones, you know? Or I'm not going to talk about
all the questions. They have all the questions.
They have broad strokes.
We know
their descriptions of the questions.
Rudy wasn't there yet.
I think,
You're right.
yes, but I think they would like to try to tease out a little bit more specific so they can get prepped in advance. I also think, maybe this is cynical of me, that they would like to push this.
They know the areas. They want to know what they have Trump on.
Yes, and I think that's what they're trying to do here, is get them to tell a little bit more. I also think, and this is a little cynical, that they're trying to push this after the elections. And they firmly believe that Mueller will respect this protocol, which says you don't make huge announcements or deliver reports until before 100 days before election or so, something like that. And they think if they can get within that window, then maybe they will avoid some sort of political catastrophe that would come if this report were released before then. So there are other sort of micro calculations that are happening here. But in the end, the big one is, will Mueller use a subpoena? And they will test that theory, I believe, if they have to. And we'll see where it goes. But having over Brett Kavanaugh.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.